Actually, the leap of faith, to give it the memorable name that Soren Kierkegaard bestowed upon it, is an imposture. As he himself pointed out, it is not a leap that can be made once and for all. It is a leap that has to go on and on being performed in spite of mounting evidence to the contrary. This effort is actually too much for the human mind and leads to delusions and manias. Religion understands perfectly well that the leap is subject to sharply diminishing returns, which is why it often doesn't in fact rely on faith at all, but instead corrupts faith and insults reason.
You are listening to A Leap of Doubt, the podcast that celebrates science, secular humanism, and the courage it takes to embrace an evidence-based life of doubt and questioning.
If the account given in Genesis is really true, ought we not, after all, to thank this serpent? He was the first schoolmaster, the first advocate of learning, the first enemy of ignorance, the first to whisper in human ears the sacred word liberty, the creator of ambition, the author of modesty, of inquiry, of doubt, of investigation, of progress, and of civilization. Give me the storm and the tempest of thought and action, rather than the dead calm of ignorance and faith. Banish me from Eden when you will, but first let me eat of the fruit of the tree of knowledge.
Hello, listeners. It is I, Nathan Dickey. The words you just heard were written by Robert Greene Ingersoll, 1833 to 1899, from his 1872 lecture entitled The Gods. Read by Ted DeLorme. The audio is courtesy of LibriVox.org's royalty-free audiobook Lectures of Colonel R.G. Ingersoll, Volume 1. Known by his many followers and detractors alike as the Great Agnostic, Robert Greene Ingersoll was a central and pivotal figure of the Golden Age of Freethought in the American Midwest of the mid-19th century. The Golden Age of Freethought and the life of Robert Ingersoll is what this much belated episode is all about, and I enjoyed talking with my guest Justin Clark about these things. Since this interview was recorded, Justin has stepped down, at least temporarily, from his involvement with ReasonRevolution.org, the secular humanist and philosophy website he co-founded. I wish Justin the best and want to thank him for joining me for this recording, which might just be my favorite episode of my little podcast so far. I also want to let any listeners I may have know that I'm not finished with this podcasting endeavor. I've had a rough couple of months, which involved me taking a hiatus from social media for a couple weeks and some hard reflection on where my show fits into the pod sphere maintained by the community of secular podcasters of which I am a part. Podcasting can be a tough and lonely job, especially when you first start out, but I truly love doing this, and I know I can only get better the more I do this. The level of encouragement I've received from people I've come to count as close friends has been unexpected, humbling, and inspiring. I especially want to thank Rich Lyons, who has edited this episode you are about to hear. I also want to thank my 4 patrons, Jeannie Eichard, Jeff Prebeg, Torsten Pill, and Chris Watson. Thank you very much for your support. It means a lot to me, and you're a large part of the reason I'm going to keep on doing this. And with that, that's all I have to say as far as the introductory and housekeeping matters go. I hope you enjoy this episode. Hello, dear listeners, and welcome to episode number 12 of my podcast, A Leap of Doubt. I'm your host, Nathan Dickey. On this episode, we are diving into American history, specifically the history of the American Freethought movement, and even more specifically, the Golden Age of Freethought from the late 19th century to the beginning of World War I, roughly. The dates are kind of arbitrary there, depending on which historian you speak to, because I think it's important as atheists in the 21st century, atheists and free thinkers and secular humanists, to really dive into our history and our heritage and to learn from the past about what we can be doing now, what differences exist, what similarities exist, and what that means for our continuing history going forward. Joining me on this episode is Justin Clark. He is a public historian, intellectual historian, and host of the Reason Revolution podcast. Welcome, sir.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm really looking forward to the conversation.
Oh, likewise. Your thing is public history and kind of bringing to the general public an understanding of history, especially local history in your neck of the woods in Indianapolis.
Yeah, I cover a lot of Indiana history in my day job. Yeah.
Indiana generally. I don't know if you're the Indianapolis area or I just threw that out there.
So I work at the Indiana Historical Bureau. We're a state historical agency located out of Indianapolis, state capital. And the main thing that we work on is our state historical marker program. And the marker program is been around for nearly 100 years. And if you see these big, beautiful blue and gold signs in Indiana with history content on them, that's what we do. But alongside that, we also work on something called Hoosier State Chronicles, which is our statewide historic digital newspaper program. And that's what I work on full time. And that's my area of expertise as of the last year and a half or so. I digitize the history Indiana newspapers. So I digitize old newspapers, and we have nearly 1 million pages of digitized newspapers from nearly 200 years of Indiana history. And they're freely available online, which is really, really cool. You can check them out at HoosierStateChronicles.org. It's all there, and you can check that out. And that's what I work in my day job. But outside of that, I also write articles and essays for my website, reasonrevolution.org. And basically what I do with those is I sort of try to chronicle the history and the impact and influence of leaders of the past. So we have a whole section called Humanist Histories, where I sort of unpack some of those subjects. We've done 2 of those essays so far. First one's on Emma Goldman, the anarchist philosopher who was an atheist, and she wrote really interesting stuff about atheism. And the second essay I've done is a sort of retooled version of an older essay I wrote on an Indianapolis publisher named W.H. LeMaster, who was a freethought. He was a free thinker and a freethought newspaper publisher at Indianapolis. He published a newspaper in the 1880s called The Iconoclast, and he'll probably come back up in our conversation on the Golden Age of Freethought. So that's kind of what I do, both for my day job and out of work. But basically what I try to do is I try to articulate the history of ideas and sort of what people believed, why they believed it, and how it informed what they did.
And I think you do that really well. And
Thank you.
I think it's really amazing and important work, because the modern age of technology meeting the primary source material of history, whether it's ancient history or more relatively recent history, because in our digital age, we have access to so much information about our history, so much more resources than even people at that time did. I think one estimate I read from a historian a while ago was that a single issue of the New York Times, even in hard copy form, the actual newspaper, contains more information than a person in the 1800s was likely to come across in their lifetime.
Wow, that's amazing.
So I think who knows how much that is enlarged with the digital world and all this information at our fingertips. And I think it's really important that you and people like you who do this archive work are taking this historical information and putting it in essentially indestructible form.
Yeah, in some ways, yeah, for sure. I mean, I'll give you a little factoid that I think your audience might like. So all the digitization that we do for newspapers for our program, which feeds into the National Digital Newspaper Program, which is a joint venture between the Library of Congress and the National Endowment for the Humanities, we digitize based off of second generation silver halide polyester-based microfilm. So the thing that's really cool is when people think that digital is sort of forever, and in some ways it is, but in a lot of ways it actually isn't, because digital technology changes so much. And for archival purposes, it's not terribly great, because if you have an EMP spike, you kind of lose everything. So when we actually digitize everything, we actually send, for every batch of newspapers that we digitize, we send the Library of Congress permanent archival master film Silver halide's the emulsion, so the image itself is based out of silver, and then the plastic base that's on it's actually not plastic; it's a polyester base. And here's the fun part about that. So, if stored in the correct archival conditions, those master microfilm reels will last for 500 years. They're not cheap, but they're made to last for a relatively long time. And so if they ever had to redigitize, they could digitize off of those master film and we wouldn't worry about what we lose because things change all the time in the digital space. So in some respects, the analog of the microfilm is still one of the best ways to archive it. But for our purposes digitally, it's wonderful that we can have it on a website and on the Library of Congress's servers and then our internal servers out of the library. So we have nearly 330,000 pages of Indiana newspapers in Chronicling America, which is the national digital newspaper program you can check out. And then we have nearly 1 million in Hoosier State Chronicles. So it's a really amazing, wonderful project. And the thing is, it's all keyword searchable. It's all date searchable. So if you're looking for something in particular, you can probably find it.
If there's anybody listening right now who's both a big history nerd and a computer nerd, they're probably experiencing the equivalent of listening to porn right now.
Well, one thing I'll tell them just to sort of sweeten the pot, with Chronicling America, it's all an open API, which means that if you're a data guy and you want to do big data analyses with what we have in Chronicling America, you can actually download whole chunks of what is available through Chronicling America and do big data analysis of it if you want.
Getting into the meat of our discussion, we are talking about, as I said in the introduction, the Golden Age of Freethought, and really diving into the history that's really important to us as atheists and freethinkers and secular humanist activists today. And you wrote a master's thesis on this about freethought and religion and the interplay between them in the central Midwest during the 19th century. Maybe talk about what motivated you to choose that as your master's thesis.
Well, it really started with, I watched a video that was put out a few years ago with Penn Jillette of Penn and Teller, and someone asked him, is this the best time in America to be an atheist? And he said, no. And they asked, well, what was it? And he said, well, probably the late 19th century. And the reason he said that was, he said, if you look back at the late 19th century, the two biggest public speakers in America, the biggest both in terms of popularity and in terms of paycheck, were Mark Twain and Robert Ingersoll. Now, most people know who Mark Twain is. I mean, obviously, he's a national treasure, but Robert Ingersoll is somebody that people don't know. So I used my graduate research to sort of unpack his life because I found him to be fascinating. I was like, well, who is this Robert Ingersoll guy? Well, it turns out that he was one of the most beloved and well-known public speakers in America during the late 19th century, both to believers and non-believers alike. So he gave a whole bunch of different lectures that were actually non-religious too. So he gave lectures on Abraham Lincoln and he gave lectures on Shakespeare and poetry and all kinds of stuff like that. But he's best remembered today for the stuff that he did in criticizing religion. And so he would give these speeches to sold out crowds, thousands of people that would criticize the Bible. They would criticize Christianity, religion in general. And he did this for about 25 years and was very beloved and well known all across the country. And what's funny is, you know, he sort of garnered a reputation of being a bright, decent guy and was well connected within Republican politics, Republican Party politics at the time, but he never really got to cross over because of his irreligious views. He was known as the Great Agnostic, and he was sort of the de facto leader of what scholars have called, and what I call in my thesis, the Golden Age of Freethought, which starts basically right after the Civil War and goes till about World War I, and then it sort of tapers off. But that was kind of the inspiration, was just sort of finding his work and looking at it and going, wow, this guy's absolutely fascinating. And seeing that there wasn't a lot of historical scholarship on him either recently or ever. So I tried to fill some gaps and sort of unpack his life. And so my two questions that I had sort of going into the thesis were, how did the Midwest as a region of the country influence Robert Ingersoll as a person, because he was from Illinois and lived in Illinois a big chunk of his life? And then how did he in turn influence the Midwest as a public intellectual? And so that's sort of what I tried to get at with my graduate research.
Well, I too have found Robert Ingersoll to be a fascinating figure, and a little bit of how I discovered him about 8 years ago or so, right about the time I came out publicly as an atheist as a sophomore in college. I had the advantage of living on campus and spending huge chunks of my time in the university library. And I found his works there in the section on atheism, a small little section kind of cloistered within the general religion section of the library. And just digging through his works, finding his oratory just infectious and addicting just to read and just to dive into. And I remember thinking to myself, this guy was the Christopher Hitchens of his day in a lot of ways. He, as you mentioned, he covered a lot of topics outside the areas of religion and atheism, as did Christopher Hitchens, who also wrote about politics, wrote a biography of Kissinger, wrote a lot about the American political landscape. And so I see a lot of similarities there.
Oh, yeah. I think it's very fair to say that he was a lot like Hitchens. I would say the one area in which I think they're different is in terms of debating. So Ingersoll preferred a different approach to debates. As far as I know, at least according to Ingersoll biographer Frank Smith, Ingersoll only actually performed one public debate with a preacher. And it's unclear as to who did better in the debate, whether it was him or the preacher, but he at least only did one. But what he actually preferred to do was he actually preferred using newspapers as a means of being able to sort of get his ideas across when debating believers. So he would often write a lecture, and then he'd give a lecture on Christianity or the Bible or something. And then a preacher would sort of write a response to him that would be either published in the newspaper or would be published in a pamphlet. Back in the late 19th century, pamphlets were a huge deal. Newspaper publishers and book publishers would publish these 5 and sort of 10-cent, 15-cent pamphlets. And they were sort of the social media of their day. You know, you get quick information fast. It was pretty easily available to everybody.
I like to think of it as the podcasting of the day.
Oh, yeah, definitely. Absolutely. And so Ingersoll would then respond to whatever they had to say and things like that, and they would sort of let it go back and forth in the press. Whereas Hitchens was way more interested in the public arena and doing debates. It's unclear as to whether or not Ingersoll did that as a personal choice or whether it was just his style. I like to think a lot of it just had to do with it, that it was his style. He preferred using the medium of the press as a means, as sort of a medium between these people, because a lot of them could be very, very mean, actually. So he had to sort of deal with that. And sometimes he had to fight back against incorrect criticism. So there's this story of a preacher who called him a drunk at one point and said that he was drunk and he was drunk in front of his son or whatever thing at the dinner table. And Ingersoll replied back in the newspaper saying, well, first off, we never drink at the table at dinner. And 2, I don't have a son. I only have 2 daughters. So, which he did. He didn't have a son. He had a son-in-law who he loved very much. Another big difference between him and Hitchens was very much Hitchens was a very sort of libertine man. You know, drank a lot, smoked a lot, sort of lived on the edges of the world and things like that. And Ingersoll never really did that. He was always a very sort of straight-laced and pretty, you know, in some respects, very personally conservative guy. You know, he didn't really drink all that much, and he had a wonderful relationship with his wife and his children, and he took care of them until the end of his life. They all lived in this big, huge compound up in upstate New York, where he lived, I think, the last 10 years or so of his life, and was known as one of the most moral, upright people at the time. And in fact, you can hear a lot of the believers who would debate him in the press would say, you know, we don't agree with his ideas. We think he's an infidel and a heretic, but he's an incredibly upstanding, good man. And then that's something that constantly goes through, is that Ingersoll's a good guy. And so a lot of times the debates were mainly just about ideas. They tried not to sling mud at each other.
I think that's really important, and maybe that at least partly contributed to his stature in the popular culture of his time, because I'm sure at that time, just as today, there was the popular conception and image of atheists as infidels and dirty lowlifes and that kind of caricature and stereotyping. And so that contrast with Ingersoll as being the most prominent unbeliever of his region in that time maybe was part of what contributed to his prominence and popularity, although not the whole story, of course.
Yeah, I think that's fair. I think that he was beloved in a lot of ways. And a lot of that had to do with the fact that he sort of came to national renown with his oratory on politics. You know, he gives a speech in 1868 in Indianapolis, in fact, which is known as the Masters of War speech, where it's one of the most beautiful anti-war speeches ever given. And it's an amazing speech about, you know, sort of the horrors of the Civil War, because he, of course, fought in the Civil War. He fought for the Illinois Cavalry and was in the Battle of Shiloh. He had been a prisoner of war. And so he knew sort of what the horrors of war were like, and they influenced his views on both politics and on religion. And the other big speech that he gave was in 1876, which was called the Plumed Knight speech, which was a speech in support of then presidential candidate James G. Blaine, who was running for the Republican primary. Blaine would eventually lose the primary to Rutherford B. Hayes, and Hayes would go on to win the election in one of the most contested presidential contests in American history. But from that point, you know, he was personal friends with three presidents. Basically, every president from Grant to McKinley on the Republican Party side essentially called for his support. And they all asked him to sort of campaign on his behalf. Because one thing you have to keep in mind, during the late 19th century, until basically McKinley, and McKinley's election kind of changes as the one in 1896. But before that, it was seen as very improper and uncouth for a presidential candidate to campaign on their own behalf. So, you know, they would stay home and then they would send out surrogates, people who would talk for them on their behalf. And Ingersoll was one of the best well-known presidential campaign circuits of his time. And so people really loved him for his political oratory and for his connections within the Republican Party. He was very, very well connected within the party. His brother was a congressman, and often sort of, you know, even though his brother was in the Congress, they sort of worked as a team. So if Ingersoll thought of a good policy idea, he'd often shift it to his brother. His brother would introduce it in Congress. So he was very well known and well beloved.
Yeah, one thing I was wondering about was this period of free thought becoming prominent in the public eye in the American Midwest, especially during the 19th century. There's that period, which is actually less talked about in American history in terms of the history of atheism. It's less talked about than, say, Enlightenment Deism during the 18th century with the founders of America. What differences exist? What would you say are like the main differences between the Golden Age of Freethought and Enlightenment Deism?
Well, I would say the big, huge difference was Darwin. The impact of Darwin, I think, cannot be understated, because I'm kind of in the mind that this is an argument that Steven Pinker has recently made in his book Enlightenment Now. He said, you know, a lot of the Enlightenment deists, if they had been able to read Darwin, would likely have been atheists. And I'm kind of in the same camp. Understanding evolution gave us a way to be able to really do away with the notion that God created stuff. You know, with physics, it's a little bit more elusive, right? You know, which is why Newton sort of had 1 foot sort of in the natural and 1 foot in the ethereal. It's sort of for that very reason. Galileo was the same way. Whereas by the time you get to mid to late 19th century, Darwin's ideas had begun to permeate the culture. And I think that had a huge impact. I think the other impact was the availability of lectures and the lecturing circuit. With the rise of sort of modern industrial capitalism in the late 19th century in the United States, it allowed more and more people to have disposable income that they had never had before. And in having that disposable income, they could spend it on things like lectures and things like pamphlets. And so it was a lot easier to both publish and disseminate material, and it was a lot easier for people to consume it. And I think the other big difference is that the Golden Age of Freethought and sort of its leaders, people like Ingersoll, people like Elizabeth Cady Stanton and others, they sort of had the benefit of hindsight. They had sort of seen the Second Great Awakening and sort of its influence. And they sort of were able to reflect back sort of their interpretation of it in a way that the founders couldn't, because they predated the Second Great Awakening in some respects. So that's where I think they're different. And then where I think they're very similar is in the commitment to the separation of church and state, right, and a real commitment to throwing off the trappings of traditions. This is something that, you know, Ingersoll writes about a lot, is this idea that, We have all these superstitious traditions that sort of hold us back as a people, and that if we were to only get rid of them, we could make a better world. And this is really where you get the difference between sort of basic, oh yeah, I believe the separation of church and state, to actually affirming like, no, I actually think that not only is the separation of church and state great, I actually think being non-religious is a virtue in and of itself. I think that lacking faith is something that is actually beneficial to people, and that we can build a better world if people didn't actually connect themselves so sort of slavishly to religion. So in that regard, I think that's where they're different.
Ingersoll, in a lot of ways, picked up where Thomas Paine left off. Thomas Paine, of course, being the author
I think
of
so. And I
The Age of Reason. Because I remember reading The Age of Reason as a new atheist in college and being struck by his, what we today recognize as a very atheistic tone, if it was written in today's language. But there was always, throughout that work of Paine's, there was that adherence to the God of deism and this idea that religion is so corrupt that it's not worthy of God, whereas Ingersoll comes along, and of course others before him, because there is, in all of history and in all of intellectual history, there is a continuation of and a development of thought, a line going through. Ingersoll stands out as somebody who really picked up where Paine left off, because he said he kind of affirmed and repopularized what Paine was writing about, with the added statement that we don't need to hold to an idea of God anymore either. We can question the existence of God, and we can call religion corrupt, and we don't need to hold those two ideas separately.
Ingersoll moved the debate from not just being about what Paine's notion was, religion perverts what we know about God, and Ingersoll's like, nah, religion just perverts, period. And I think that's the key distinction. And again, I think you get to that place because of the advancement of Darwinism, the advancement of scientific ideas, and the advance of science as a field, and sort of becomes more professionalized and systematized during the late 19th century. And that, I think, adds a certain level of credibility to what science is trying to do. And I think also Ingersoll, ironically enough, he's called the great agnostic, but he sort of saw being an agnostic and an atheist as sort of the same thing. So if you were to sort of put him in modern language, he'd be an agnostic atheist. So on the question of knowledge, he would say he would lack the knowledge of the existence of God. But when it comes to belief, he wouldn't believe it. And he uses the language of the agnosticism and atheism pretty interchangeably. I've read some of his letters where he calls himself an atheist and doesn't see a contradiction in calling those two positions. But agnosticism was the term that was used at the time because it was more palatable to people. It was a term coined by Thomas Henry Huxley, who was known as Darwin's bulldog, who would give sort of lectures on evolution, because Darwin was famously non-confrontational, whereas Huxley didn't mind it. And agnosticism was basically the I don't know position. And it was a lot more palatable for people to sort of get onto that than it was to flat out say atheist, although Ingersoll didn't really see a difference between the two. But he sort of just called himself an agnostic because of the parlance of the time. And I think that you can see that natural progression from the founders, people like Paine and Jefferson and Benjamin Franklin and Ethan Allen, of the deism of the sort of Spinoza-esque God of nature or God of everything, to Ingersoll's agnosticism, Huxley's agnosticism, to the 20th century and the emergence of, no, we're not even going to do that language anymore. We're just going to be atheists.
In what sense can Ingersoll be considered a public intellectual of his time? I know that you've written in your master's thesis that he's been unfairly not taken into account by some scholars as a serious intellectual.
Yeah, so the main person that I'm sort of refuting and rebutting in my thesis is a scholar named S.T. Yoshi, who's written books. He's mainly a H.P. Lovecraft scholar, but he's written stuff on atheism. He's written stuff about, and he's done compendiums. We wrote this book called The Non-Believers, which was a modern history of disbelief. And he says right out in the front of the book, he says, now, a lot of people are going to see this book on modern atheism and go, where is Robert Ingersoll? Why isn't Robert Ingersoll in here? And he basically just says that Ingersoll isn't worth paying attention to, which is weird to me because he spends an incredible amount of time talking about other people I don't necessarily think should be paid attention to either. But, this idea that you're going to ignore him, basically because he says that, Ingersoll was mostly known for his oratorical skills and not for his ideas. And so there's really no need to pay attention to him seriously in that regard. And I found a huge issue with that. I was like, no, that's not at all how I view this. And so I sort of argue in my thesis that Ingersoll was a deeply engaged public intellectual. So what he did was he was a polymath, and he studied all kinds of different ideas from science, theology, history, philosophy, science, and all kinds of other subjects. And what he would do is he would then make lectures and books and discourses and pamphlets and essays and newspaper articles that would make these ideas palatable to the general public. This ability to systematize knowledge and analyze it and to be able to make it palatable to the average person, to me, is the very definition of being a public intellectual. The other thing I think that's incredibly important in discussing Ingersoll is the notion that he was able to sort of be a prism for the religious critics of his. So what I mean by that is you sort of think of the white beam of light, which is Ingersoll, and you have through a prism, you have a bunch of different colors. He was able to respond to a bunch of different people with a bunch of different criticisms of him and then respond back and forth. And to me, that's another indication that he was a deeply engaged public intellectual. I think he's often unfairly maligned because of his ability to be, I think, incredibly oratorically profound and eloquent, but there's a real intellectual heft behind what he's trying to do, but he's doing it in a way that's very accessible to people. So is he a philosopher? No, but he is a public intellectual.
I think one thing that all intellectuals should strive to do is to make ideas accessible to everybody. Because if only the scholars, if only the philosophers and scientists are talking among themselves and leaving out the participation aspect and not paying any attention to the question of, hey, should we be synthesizing these ideas and popularizing them so that everybody can benefit from the knowledge that we are kind of pioneering in the work that we are trained to do? I think it's really important for democracy, and this is going back to Ingersoll's connection with politics, to make these ideas accessible so that social change can happen on a large scale, because it takes more than the ivory tower intellectuals. It takes everybody to make important change happen on a level that affects everybody and includes everybody.
Yeah, I completely agree. And so would have Ingersoll. I mean, he valued his study of ideas and valued the importance of educating people on ideas. And he spent his life dedicated to doing that. And he cared deeply about it. And this idea that a public intellectual has to be somebody with a PhD or is not necessarily the case. I mean, Robert Ingersoll never went to college. He was a self-made man. He taught himself the law. He passed the bar exam of Illinois on the hard knocks and gumption. Now, he had the benefit of having a very well-educated father in John Ingersoll, who was a minister, and he grew up with books all around his home in a very liberal atmosphere where his father was an abolitionist. As a small child, he grew up in the burned-over district of upstate New York, which is a hotbed of radicalism and abolitionism and suffrage movement. And then he comes to the Midwest in the 1850s, and he stays there for 20 years, and that influences a great deal of what he eventually does. And I think that Ingersoll viewed everything as an integrated whole. He viewed that his view of religion influenced his view of democracy, which influenced his view of social roles and social politics and influenced his views on women. The word feminist really didn't exist back then in some ways, but he would have identified with that. He was definitely very forward-thinking on African-American relations, and I think that today, had Ingersoll been alive today, he would have been a feminist. He would have supported Black Lives Matter. He would have been a big champion, I think, personally, of the LGBTQ movement, had he learned about it, had he known about it. He was a man who was deeply open-minded and had a great deal of empathy for other people. The word humanist also didn't exist back then, but in my view, he is one of the sort of great humanists of that period and sort of embodied what we're trying to do as humanists in his own life. So yeah, I very much believe deeply that his role as a public intellectual was to make these ideas popular so that people could have better conversations, and in having better conversations, we can make a better society.
And I think this is something that still goes on to this day, the kind of looking down or looking askance at people who popularize ideas. This happened to Carl Sagan, of all people, the astronomer who was widely considered, even by his fellow astronomers in the National Academy of Sciences, to not be worthy enough to be included as a member because they looked down on his work as being merely popularizing science. And so that same kind of unfair treatment of what counts as hard intellectual work still goes on to this day.
Oh, yeah. And we see the pushback against people like Neil deGrasse Tyson is another example of someone who gets pushed back. There's every other year or so, there's the hot take of Neil deGrasse Tyson dumbs down science and makes it and takes the fun out of it or takes the joy out of it or whatever. There's always a price to be paid for, in some respects, professionally, for going the route that people like Carl Sagan do, or did rather, because it's academia is a very fickle place and it's incredibly political, and not in the sense like politics, like left, right, or it's just a political business.
Right.
Where, you know, there's huge egos, you know, you have to worry about funding and do we get the grant? Do we get this? Do we get that? Do we get tenure? Did I get this published? You know, whatever. And I think what's sad about in Sagan's case is Sagan did groundbreaking work in the greenhouse effect of Venus, which is probably his most important scientific work that helped us understand the components of climate change better. So, you know, Sagan, you know, he worked on the Voyager project. He worked on the Viking project. It's not like he didn't have the chops, because he clearly did. You know, he taught for years at Cornell. Not to be voted to become a member of the National Academy of the Sciences was a great shame. He won some like public service award from them, but that's just bullshit. They should have let him in. And Bill Nye gets the same crap from people.
Oh yeah, people who look down on engineering as not a real science, or they somehow view applied science as somehow less worthy than the brainy science.
Part of that, I think, is just that I think in our culture, you know, there's a huge, I don't know if it's anti-science, but there's a huge allergy to science, particularly in the liberal arts. And you know, in my field, I mean, the amount of people I've met and talked to who literally almost know nothing about science. And they sort of see it as a badge of honor, like, oh, I don't bother myself with this kind of stuff. And I think that's really a problem. I think it's a problem to have literature departments that don't talk to science departments and science departments that don't talk to historians. I mean, that's part of the problem of the professionalization of academic disciplines, is that everything becomes so scattered that we look at people like Carl Sagan, or as we've been talking earlier, people like Robert Ingersoll, people who know a little about everything and try to educate people on a whole wide range of topics, that's sort of looked down upon. And I think that's a huge problem, because I think that our world is benefited by people who can take ideas that are incredibly complex and make them easier for people to understand, and to make them not just easier, but very compelling and poetic and beautiful. I don't understand why that's looked down upon as being pedestrian. I mean, I think that actually sounds really fucking hard. It is super easy to write a essay of almost indecipherable gibberish in academia, and people look at you like you're so fucking smart. But when you try to actually articulate that in a way that people can generally read, people look at that and just like they get grossed out by it. I find that to be a huge problem, and it's something I fight back with my own work.
It takes a certain level of genius to translate these high concepts of science and philosophy into language that everybody can understand. It takes somebody with a lot of intellect and genius, I think.
Yeah.
And yeah, I think specialization has its place, but I think over-specialization really decreases the net amount of knowledge that is accessible to everybody. And that in turn can lead to very catastrophic results in politics and in social life, and can actually contribute to the rise of authoritarianism.
Yeah, I think so. One of the beauties of people like Ingersoll, or people a century before him who were part of the Enlightenment, but these were people who very much viewed the pursuit of knowledge, and a wide variety of knowledge, as a good end in and of itself. And because of that, they learned a wide variety of different disciplines and tried their best to sort of apply what they learn in one discipline to another discipline. And that's what the Enlightenment was really about in a lot of ways, was it was applying the sort of experimental open-mindedness of the scientific process to social questions. And how can we, if you look at somebody like Hobbes, sort of Hobbes saw what he was doing was a science of politics. Or somebody like Adam Smith with A Wealth of Nations. It's the same thing. It's sort of a science of economics. It's trying to use the tools of science as a means to underscore social issues. And I think that's a great thing. And I think people hear that kind of stuff in our culture and get absolutely just like apoplectic about it because their first thought is like eugenics and shit.
Yeah,
but the big problem is that, we live in a society that's way more ethical than it was back then. And we have incredibly high standards for scientific research. And I think that with some people, it's either an either or. It's either we embrace science fully at the sort of detriment of philosophy and the humanities, or people who are just sort of all about the humanities and they think the sciences are sort of just dirty and gross. And what I've advocated for years has been what, E.O. Wilson, the biologist E.O. Wilson, called consilience, or unification of knowledge, that all of these different pursuits feed into the universal knowledge that we have. And I think that we benefit from trading with one another and from learning from one another.
I talked about this very thing with my friend John Wathy on a previous episode number 8. He is a neurobiologist and a computational evolutionary biologist who works with evolutionary algorithms and protein folding. He's the author of The Illusion of God's Presence. And he has advocated in several articles that he's published online of what he terms a pragmatic party, a political party that is science-based and evidence-based. And he has taken his cue from the work of Jacob Bronowski, the great Polish mathematician and polymath who, of course, is known also as a popularizer of ideas with his Ascent of Man documentary series in the 1970s, which predates Carl Sagan's Cosmos and was even more unheard of in his time. And Bronowski, in one of his books, says this very thing, that we should take an empirical approach to how we choose to run society, how we conduct our politics, and how we approach the humanities. And when we're talking about things like, say, the population explosion, instead of dividing ourselves up into political camps that talk only in terms of what our tribe believes in and getting hung up on these various devotions that we have politically, we should just all get together and say, let's just talk about the birth rate. Let's just talk about the empirical facts that affect us all, regardless of our various beliefs. And that's an extremely hard thing for us as a species to do.
I think another part of it that's a huge component to it is the fact that there are people who have sort of utopian visions, people who think that they can sort of make the perfect society, or there's this sort of thing called root causism, which is if we just get to the root cause of this problem, whether it's race or class or gender or whatever, we just get to the root case of this, we can solve the problem. Well, it turns out that when we're answering social questions like that root causes are kind of bullshit. There's no one root cause of anything. And so the best way to advocate for better public policy is just to make small changes here and there. There is no sort of root cause problem to traffic accidents. There's a variety of reasons why people have traffic accidents. They're looking at their phone, they're drunk driving, the lines for pedestrians aren't clearly painted. There's all kinds of different variables. And there's a book that I love that helped me really understand this in a lot of ways, and it's called A Conflict of Visions. It's by a political economist named Thomas Sowell. And he writes about how there's really two types of political thinking. There's people who are the unconstrained human vision and the constrained human vision. People who have the constrained human vision are people who see the reality of life as it is, and it's incredibly complicated, that there's no one good answer for anything, that sometimes the policies that we create may have the best of intentions, but they actually don't really solve anything. And that it's best for us to be smart with how we use public policy, how we use our politics, to actually do things that would actually benefit people. And then there are people who sort of have the unconstrained human vision who say, well, we can do anything and we can make anything happen and we can do this and we can do that and we can make it all work and there's no limit to what we can do. Well, actually, yeah, there actually are limits. There are economic limits, there are intellectual limits, there are social limits. There are things that we just can't do because if we do them, they either won't work or they'll lead to horrible, horrible things. And the unconstrained human vision can lead to a lot of good. Like, somebody like Lyndon Johnson sort of had the unconstrained human vision of if we give everybody a hug and a lot of money, everything will be better. And in some ways that works. Social spending is good and having a social safety net is good and having a certain level of social welfare is important to a healthy democracy. But on the other hand, if you can take the unconstrained human vision to its extreme, you get communism, you get fascism, you get authoritarianism because if you don't think that human nature has any play in anything and you think that human beings can sort of be molded to whatever you want them to be, then to them, they're just a cog in the machine to you, that they're indisposable and they're not individual. And so when you have a society like that, it can lead to gulags and death camps and pogroms and holocausts because who cares? It doesn't matter. These people are just in the way of the vision we're creating for the future. As I've gotten older, my political positions haven't changed that much, but the way I approach them has, in the sense that I'm no longer sort of a wide-eyed idealist. I'm way more pragmatic. I'm way more realistic, and I'm way more sort of centrist than I used to be. But hell, even that kind of language has become politicized too, where people who are on the left or on the right bitch about people in the center. I'm not saying centrism is perfect. I think having the extremes is actually good. It helps us sort of figure out, okay, well, what clearly is absolutely batshit? And once we know what the two sides that are completely batshit, if we know that those aren't going to work, we have a good sense of what might. So to me, I just think of that a healthy democracy is one that uses science and ethics to guide public policy. And it's that simple. And it's the interplay between the two.
Reading through your master's thesis, I was really fascinated by the comparison you put forth between Robert Ingersoll and Dwight Moody, two very similar individuals in terms of their ability to impact public discussion and thought, but two very different individuals in terms of belief. And thinking about like Dwight Moody's emphasis on supernaturalism, it kind of, in a kind of tangential way, it made me think about the supernaturalism prevalent in the 19th century, especially in England, which in some respects carried over to America, not to the extent that more traditional religious ideas did. But I wonder if there's, in your research and study of 19th century free thought in America, was there any overlap or cooperation between like agnosticism and atheism in response to religion on the one hand, and like the skeptical movement that we recognize today as skeptics who question the occult and seances and divining rods and the kind of James Randi brand of skepticism. Was there any overlap in 19th century America there?
Yeah, so there's a couple examples I can give you right off the top of my head. With Ingersoll, he was always pretty open about criticizing not just gods and religions, but also just sort of the notions of ghosts or spirits or spiritualism, which was very big at the time. So he was critical of that. And then a more specific example is W.H. Lemaster, who I talked about earlier. Lemaster did this interesting thing where he did this report where he went to Terre Haute, Indiana, and he watched this seance. Now, seances were really big in the late 19th century, and people would come into a room and they'd have like the skulls and the goofy rubber hands or whatever. And people would, shit would move and they'd hear a sound. And a lot of times it was the person who was sort of the proctor of the seance, moving levers and pulling stuff and moving stuff with his feet and things like that, which Harry Houdini would debunk, decades later on his own. But Lemaster writes this long piece for the Terre Haute Papers and says this stuff is nonsense. And people should not be duped into it. He's writing this in like the 1880s. So yes, there is, I think, some overlap between that. And in terms of the period, I mean, the reason I think that the free thought movement flourished as much as it did during that period was the fact that a variety of religious beliefs and practices were flourishing at the same time. You had this huge influx of immigrants. from all over the world. So you have the rising of the Catholic population, you have the rising of a variety of different Christian populations, the beginnings of a Muslim population in America in a sizable way, Jewish culture, and then sort of more either Eastern religions or sort of non-traditional religious practices like spiritualism and things like that. So there was already a hotbed of diversity of the period, and free thought benefited from that in a lot of ways.
So as we kind of discussed briefly earlier, the period that historians roughly have a consensus on with the Golden Age of Freethought lasts from the early 1870s, right after the Civil War, to about 1914 and the start of World War I. Do you have any thoughts or speculations or even hard facts that historians generally agree on why the free thought movement in America essentially fell apart around World War I? Did it have to do with the rise of wartime itself?
Yes, I think that's a big component to it. If you look at World War I and World War II, both of them happened within a relatively short span of time. And then in between the two wars is the Great Depression. In eras of sort of political and economic unrest, it's very hard for alternative views of the world to sort of become popular and successful. I think one of the big reasons the Golden Age of Free Thought began to fall apart is that Robert Ingersoll died. He died in 1899. He died at the age of 65. He died of a massive heart attack at his home. And he was sort of the not unsung, but sort of the unacknowledged or sort of spiritual, for lack of a better phrase, the spiritual leader of the free thought movement. And when he died, the secular organizations weren't really, they didn't have him anymore to sort of be a big draw, and to be somebody who they could, organize around and maybe fundraise around. And then the other big thing is the war. With World War I, you had this huge upsurge of sort of what I call sort of Christian patriotism. And a lot of that has to do with Woodrow Wilson, who was president during World War I, who was a Presbyterian and a very deeply committed Christian. The beginnings of sort of tying this notion of God and Christianity to patriotism and wartime and rah-rahism that happens during the period. It also happens during World War II. I mean, one of the biggest popular songs for the military during World War II was Onward Christian Soldiers. So because of that, in times of great solidification of the culture under wartime or economic stress, like I said, varying competing ideological systems don't do very well, which is why you see right after World War II, you see this huge surge in protest movements and the civil rights movement, the women's rights movement, the gay rights movement. And then with basically, the 1950s and the landmark Supreme Court cases on freedom of speech and freedom of religion, the beginnings of a secular movement again. And there had always been people sort of in the interim who were important. So you have somebody like Joseph Lewis, who's super important to American atheism. So he writes pamphlets in the 30s and 40s talking about being more explicitly atheistic than even Ingersoll was, but he loved Ingersoll and was sort of Ingersoll's heir apparent. There was the Ingersoll League, which was run in the 1920s and 30s, which had meetings, and they republished some of Ingersoll's works. So you did have some of that in the 20s and 30s and 40s, but it's really not until the 1950s and 60s that you get the beginnings of that movement again. And some of that you can really attribute to Madalyn Murray O'Hair, the founder of American Atheists, who was one of the plaintiffs in a landmark Supreme Court case that ended involuntary prayer in public schools.
Thinking about the various free thought figures during wartime, I was also thinking of Chapman Cohen.
Oh, yeah, Chapman Cohen for sure.
During World War I, while it was in progress, he wrote the book War, Civilization, and the Churches. And I think if it hadn't been for what he was up against in terms of the war and the rise of Christian patriotism, I think he would have been remembered as somebody of equal stature to Ingersoll in a lot of ways, along with Joseph Wellis and some of the others you've mentioned. And the work of Madalyn Murray O'Hair in the 60s and 70s was very important too. I think in a lot of ways that was kind of the start of the Renaissance or the rebirth of free thought in America. And I think the reason maybe the four horsemen of the early 21st century after the 9/11 attacks with Dawkins, Harris, Hitchens, and Dennett, I think the reason they eclipsed a lot of what American Atheist was about and the work they did was because these were intellectuals. These were scientists, philosophers, a journalist, and an up-and-coming neurobiologist who really kickstarted a new movement and a new emphasis in response to 9/11, whereas Madalyn Murray O'Hair was viewed as kind of a pariah in a lot of ways. I think the work of the Four Horsemen lended a lot of credence and respectability to unbelief that unfortunately Madalyn Murray O'Hair was unable to do just because of the way she was kind of reviled by the public. And I don't think that the public could do the same with the Four Horsemen to the same extent because of their credentials.
Yeah, that's true. I think with Madalyn Murray O'Hair in particular, she was an incredibly difficult person, to say the least. She was very difficult to work with. She was very difficult to be around. She was not, I don't know, she didn't have a certain level of public respect and admiration in the way that somebody like Robert Ingersoll did. I mean, Ingersoll was very beloved. I mean, even if people disagreed with his his religious views, people respected him and people liked him. And he was very mainstream. I mean, he was a mainstream Republican. He held a lot of mainstream Republican views at the time, but was liberal in a lot of other ways, was way more, sort of liberal and forward thinking in a lot of other ways. But he was a guy who had an incredible amount of respect and cultural weight to him that other people didn't. And I think what happened was, with somebody like O'Hair, I think it was the fact that she was a woman, and it was much harder for women to be taken seriously on that regard during that period. And for her to be taken seriously, I think she was like, I have to be like America's villain because that's how I'll get the notoriety that I want. And I think she did a lot of good for atheism as a movement. I mean, I think that atheism is a more public, potent force because of her. But her problems, I mean, she had a very public feud with the Freedom from Religion Foundation, which was founded in the late 70s by Annie Laurie Gaylor and Ann Nickel Gaylor. And, Annie Laurie just recently wrote a statement about the recently ousted president of American Atheist, David Silverman. She said, when Madalyn Murray O'Hair was running American Atheist, she would tell people, like, don't join the FFRF. Like, don't belong to them. Don't be a part of them. She hated the FFRF. She thought that the FFRF were too nice. She thought they were too conciliatory to people who weren't explicitly atheist. And so she made a point of like, yeah, we don't want people to be members of FFRF, even though there was a tremendous amount of crossover. And I think that in the long run, I think that for as much as I think Madalyn Murray O'Hair did a lot of good, I think that if you look at the history of American, non-belief in this country and sort of in its organized way, I think FFRF is a much better organization than American Atheist is. And I think it's a more potent and successful organization than American Atheist is.
I think each has their value, but I think I would tend to agree with you. I think FFRF has their feet on the ground and they're on the front lines, whereas American Atheists have more of an emphasis on rhetoric and just challenging ideas loudly and vociferously and kind of in an intentionally irreverent way. And I think both those approaches has their value, but I think in our day and age, in the current time we live in now, I think feet on the ground, getting your hands dirty, making change, challenging theocracy directly is a lot more important.
Yeah, I think so too. And I think that with FFRF, I mean, I think one of the big things that they do alongside all of the great work they do to keep the separation of church and state, they educate the public on the history of free thought in America. And that's the other thing that they do, with their emails where they have free thought quote of the day or their podcast, free thought radio, and they share histories of people and they share quotes and they sort of do birthday celebrations, they do music, they do all kinds of different things. They're trying to put a very positive spin on things, which I really, really like and always have. But I agree with you. I don't believe in tone policing. I don't believe in, you should do this or I'm going to tell you how to talk or whatever. I don't believe in that whatsoever. I think people should be free to say what they want. And I like American Atheists for that very reason, that they're the radicals. They're the firebrands of the movement. And we need that because every once in a while you need somebody to be a hard ass. I hope that the organization can recoup from the horrible news that came out about David Silverman. and that they can really think long and hard about, okay, who do we want to lead the organization now? Do they want somebody, again, like David Silverman? I mean, the man was a master of organizing. He was a master of publicity. He was a master of getting people's attention. But maybe that didn't always work, and maybe they want to do something different. Who knows? But I wish them my best. American Atheists has always had a really rough go of it, whether it's the horrible kidnapping and murder of Madalyn Murray O'Hair to this issue lately where, and for listeners, I know I'm sort of talking around the issue, but David Silverman was fired from American Atheists for some allegations about him, whether it's sexual harassment, sexual conduct, and some form of, I think, nepotism where he wanted to hire one of his mistresses to be a part of the staff or something like that, allegedly. And again, it's like, we're just trying to bring it to the public fore, and this is another thing they can use against us, and that kind of sucks. But at the same time, we need to hold our movement accountable.
It's important to put that out there, and it's highly relevant and important to address. So thank you for that. In kind of wrapping up, I like to take a look at the history we've been discussing and apply it to today and what we can learn from it. Do you think that historians of the future, specifically people who chart and chronicle the history of free thought in the future, will they look back at this time now as a second golden age of free thought? Or is this time in the atheist, secular humanist community way too fractured for that recognition to be able to be accurate?
I do think this is the second golden age of free thought. I think we are living in it now. Or if it's not the golden age, and it's what they called sort of the 50s and 60s in comic books, they called it the silver age, and maybe it's actually that. But no, I do think that we're living in another great period of free thought. I mean, the fact that somebody like Steven Pinker, who is a very public atheist, can write a book like Enlightenment Now and talks about reason, science, and humanism, and that can be on the New York Times bestseller list. I mean, that's pretty heavy. I mean, I think that's terrific in terms of the permeation of the culture. If you look at somebody like Sam Harris, the fact that Sam Harris literally has millions of downloads on his podcast. He can fill theaters of 2,000-3,000 people, just like Ingersoll did 125 years ago. That is a huge deal, right? If you look at the explosion of conventions with the secular movement, whether you have the American Atheist Con, which just happened, or the American Humanist Association's conference, they just did another one in DC that was secular social justice and sort of talking about issues of equity and issues of representation and diversity. Like, that's all great. Like, we're living in a time where the divisions that we have in the culture are, in my opinion, they're legitimate ones. Like, some of them are bullshit and they're petty, but a lot of them are actually over differences of philosophy. And I think that's totally fine. That happened in the golden age of free thought too. There were people who were more conservative than some of the leaders of the secular movement who were secular. You have somebody like, I was talking with the author of that biography of that guy, C.E. Moore, that you told me about. And, C.E. Moore was from what I gather from the historian I talked to who wrote the book on him, was a pretty fervent anti-Semite. And Ingersoll wasn't. So, there were differences back then. There were different organizations. There were people who had differences and all kinds of things. I think the problem now is that there's a huge divide, I think, in the culture right now of non-belief between those who sort of want to continue to do the same old thing where we talk about religion, we talk about superstition, we talk about skepticism, things like that, and those who say, okay, yeah, all that's great, and we should all talk about that, not discounting that, but we should also talk about issues of class and gender and race and things like that. And I think that's important too. I think that we need to have those conversations too, because I think they're relevant to the nature of talking about non-belief. But yeah, I do think we're living in a really good time for being an atheist or a non-believer in the culture. And I think that speaks to the power of the growing movement, and it speaks to, I think, the decline of traditional religion in the West, and particularly in the United States and in Europe.
Do you have any final thoughts that you want to leave with listeners, and also plug your work and where people can find your work?
Of course. Well, first off, thank you so much for having me on. I've been really looking forward to this conversation for a long time, and I love the work that you do. And so thanks again for having me on. In terms of where you can find me, we're doing all kinds of really cool stuff with my new venture, Reason Revolution, reasonrevolution.org. Started as a podcast, but now it's really more evolved into a sort of media site where we have articles, we have memes, we have lectures, we have all kinds of cool stuff. We have a YouTube channel you can check out. Just type in Reason Revolution on YouTube. I just put up a lecture I did last week on secular humanism, which you can check out. And you can read some of our articles. We have a humanist history series, which you can read. We also have a Skeptic's Guide series. The first essay we have in the Skeptic's Guide series is an essay that's basically a primer on Jordan Peterson. My buddy Tyler wrote. It's basically a long essay about Jordan Peterson. So so I always pitch it as, we read Jordan Peterson, so you don't have to. And so Tyler wouldn't like that joke, but I do. But anyway, yeah, check that out. It's a very, very good essay. I think Tyler worked really hard on it. I think it's really interesting stuff. And I think it puts Peterson in a more interesting light than I think people often give him credit for, even though I disagree with him on a lot of things for sure. And we're going to be doing a lot of other stuff. They're going to be publishing essays, a whole bunch of stuff in the future. We got something upcoming about Fahrenheit 451 that Tyler's written. I'm working on a book.
Awesome.
I'm working on a book review for the Steven Pinker book, Enlightenment Now, which is why I kind of dropped it a lot, because it's right on my mind. I've been reading it this weekend.
Oh, yeah. I was actually planning on dropping it a lot as well, because I'm currently reading through it as well.
Awesome. So. I love Steven Pinker.
I will have links to all of that information and resources of yours in the show notes. And I just want to take this moment to shout out my 3 patrons, Jeff, Jeannie, and Pill. And you can follow me, of course, at The Natheist on Twitter. And if you enjoy my work, you can become a patron on Patreon, patreon.com/A Leap of Doubt. And with that, thank you, Justin, for joining me. And I hope to follow your work and keep in touch with you.
Absolutely.
In the future.
Thank you so much for having me on. I love the conversation.
Thank you for listening to A Leap of Doubt. If you liked what you heard, please consider leaving a review on iTunes. If you want to get involved in the kinds of discussions this show is meant to encourage, you can find a discussion group on Facebook at facebook.com/groups/ALOP discussion. You can follow me and get in touch with me on Twitter, where my username is @thenatheist. Feedback and criticisms are always welcome. The opening clip is an excerpt from the audiobook God Is Not Great by Christopher Hitchens, courtesy of Hachette Audio. Text copyright 2007 by Christopher Hitchens. Audio production copyright 2007 Hachette Audio. Used with permission. The music is Jade by Esther Nicholson and is used under license. I'd like to take this moment to give a very special shout out to my 4 patrons, Jeff Prebeg, Jeannie Eichard, Torsten Pill, and Chris Watson. If you enjoy the work I do, please consider becoming a patron on Patreon at patreon.com/A Leap of Doubt.